Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to what is most likely the final top 16 deck review of set number 3. And we're going out with a bang because the deck variety here is absolutely through the roof and reflects the incredible metagame we've had here in set 3. We're going to start off with the least popular decks, only played by one player, moving up to the most popular decks. There's a couple of decks in here which 3 players have chosen and got to the top 16 with, so an incredible amount of variety. Give the video a like if you're excited. Up first we have Amber and Amethyst Hyper Aggro by Emil Bjornfot. Apologies for butchering that, and I have to say I'm incredibly impressed that this deck has made it to the top 16. So it's important to note that this tournament was being played with a similar format to what we're going to be seeing at the challenge events, the official events, which is a best of 2 format. And the point scoring system for that has actually changed recently, where now the way it works is you get 3 points per game win, as in we play the first game, let's say I win, and then we play the second game and you win, we'd both end on 3 points. However, if you win 2-0, rather than just getting 6 points, you get 1 bonus point, which means you would get 7 points. Previously, the way it worked is you would get 1 point for each win and then a bonus point for a 2-0. So you'd have 3 points for a win, 1 point for a draw. So the scoring system works in an identical way. The slight difference here is the weight of the bonus point is reduced quite significantly. What this means then is that the draws with the newer format are worth a little bit more. Previously, when you drew, it kind of just felt like a loss. It felt like, why do I care about drawing? I just want to win 2-0 each time. And while the 2-0 wins are still very, very impactful, and you do need around 5 of them in order to make the top 16 cut out of 9 rounds, you do still need to get a lot of wins, but those draws are now more rewarding. I actually gave a bit of feedback saying that I felt the bonus point was too heavily weighted, and this change has actually addressed that. So I'm super happy with the change. I think really, really big credit to Ravensburger because I think they're all over it. But let's talk more about the deck itself. So obviously, if a hyper aggro deck has made the top 16 in the best of 2 format, this means that this deck has been able to win while going second very consistently. And I have to say, this is what I would refer to as a pile of cards, because there is some absolutely wacky cards in here. I mean, the first one that catches the eye is Hey Hey, Jiminy Cricket, and Lena Saberwing. This is a 1/3 rush character, which is just mind-blowing. So I wouldn't say this is necessarily an optimized deck. There's some Mufasas in here. Really, really fascinating stuff. A few Peditas. There's a Maleficent Legendary from set 3. There's the Madam Mim Shift card. Super, super fascinating. So obviously what this one's looking to do is, when it going first, just going to be looking to quest pretty aggressively. But then when going second, I suppose you've got a few more control options with cards like Rafiki. Obviously your Madam Mim Fox are also very, very impactful cards when going second. Also important to note that there's Merlin Crab for some more control when going second. There's the Peter Pan Shadow as well. Only one Madam Mim Snake seems very, very curious. Super impressed this deck made it this far. Not only, to be completely honest, that a hyper aggro deck can do so well in a best of 2 format. I think that's really, really promising. But this doesn't look particularly optimized, if I'm honest. I don't want to be a hater. Big respect to Emil. But there's definitely some wacky cards in here. And I think you're probably going to be better off, for example, playing 3 Madam Mim Snakes of this one, and maybe reducing the counts of cards like Lena Saberwing and Jiminy Cricket, for example. But big respect. Super, super interesting to see. Also, no Lilos or no 1-drop Maleficents in this one. So despite being a very aggressive deck, it's got a little bit more of a curve. I honestly love the look of it. Perdita in general is a card I think is pretty underexplored and maybe the highest potential card left to experiment with a bit more in set 3. And I'm really excited to see a Perdita deck doing this well. So big shout out to Emil. And I would be rooting for them, but they are actually playing in the first round against a good friend of mine, so we'll be looking at their deck pretty soon. Up next we have Alexis Valentine, or Flaxo, on Ruby Amethyst, the only Ruby Amethyst deck to make the top 16. Ruby Amethyst is a super fascinating deck because it performed incredibly well at the local set championships. And I think this really is a deck which is great if you're a very strong player and your opponents are maybe making a misplay or two. This deck just absolutely cleans up. However, it does seem to struggle a little bit more at the biggest of events with the best players, where It's just slightly, even though it's got a very good matchup spread across the board, there's a few matchups where it's just slightly unfavored, and therefore against top players that are making optimal plays, it does struggle seemingly to make the big wins. It makes a lot of top cuts, but struggles to actually win events. But maybe this one could be different. The biggest thing really that catches the eye is the inclusion here of Peter Pan Shadow, which we also saw in the Amber Amethyst deck. And what's also very interesting, if you haven't already been seeing my card review videos from set 4, there is a 3-cost Peter Pan, which is like the reverse of Peter Pan Shadow, which is giving your evasive characters rush. So there's the potential of some all-in evasive rush deck with set 4, which is quite exciting. 2 copies of Pinocchio. Usually we're seeing players lean more towards 1 copy of Pinocchio because it can be quite clunky if you end up with 2. But having 2 is certainly going to be improving your matchups into Steel Songs, I would imagine, being able to exert your opponent's Cinderella and take it out. Also going to improve your matchup, for example, into green decks if you can hit their Ursula Deceiver of All. Only 2 copies of Maleficent, which is something I quite like to see. I'm not a huge fan of this card. Probably the Peter Pan Shadow is what's come in here to replace the Maleficent Sorceress. And the rest of the deck looks pretty standard. 2 Tremaines, 3 Medusas, 3 Be Prepared. I think Ruby Amethyst is a really, really good deck and is kind of a testament to the incredible design team and balance of this game, because this deck is like perfectly balanced this set. It's like just the super middle ground. I've referred to it as a wet noodle deck in the past, which I somewhat stand by, but it's clearly an incredible deck for very strong players. But seemingly, again, at your local metagames, it's great, but at these bigger events, the online ones or the big challenge events, I would imagine it's not going to be topping the events. But Alexis is going to be trying to prove me wrong, and excited to see them in action. Up next, we have Steel Amethyst. Now, this is where we're onto the decks which have 2 different players making the top cut with them. Steel Amethyst has made an entrance in a big way, but actually there's 2 very different Steel Amethyst decks, because the next one we're going to look at is Jafar. But this is a deck I'm super fascinated in. I believe it was Zan Said who popularized a deck very, very similar to this. It is actually one I've done a couple coaching sessions on. So if you're interested in my coaching as well, send me an email if you'd like to get some coaching from myself. Something I really enjoyed doing. And I was very impressed by this deck. In fact, if I wasn't taking a bit of a break towards the end of the set here to kind of just give myself a bit of time off, don't want to burn myself out on the game, this is absolutely a deck I would be exploring. Very similar to Amethyst with Emerald, kind of also similar to Ruby Amethyst, but with Steel instead. I think that these Amethyst decks all feel quite similar because the bounce package is just so solid. Crab, Fox, Mim, Goat, Merlin. This one, no Rafiki, but instead with the Captain Hook. And important to note, the 3 copies of Pinocchio, which is a lot. But this deck really is... I'm super surprised to see there's only 2 Robin Hoods, actually. Because to me, with the Pinocchios, this deck is really just looking to get big Robin Hood value. You use the Pinocchio to exert something, you take it out with Robin Hood while gaining lore, which is really a powerful tool. 4 copies of Strength is interesting to see as well. Only 3 copies of Zeus. Again, I would actually expect 4 copies of Zeus in a list like this, because Zeus is really shining, being able to sing it with the rabbit and the goat. 4 copies of Castle, 1 Yzma, 1 Spellbook. Definitely a solid deck. I would probably build it ever so slightly differently. Like I say, I think I would probably like to see more copies of the Robin Hood in there, but I don't really have much experience with the deck. Nolan really, really doing well with it, clearly. Another card I do want to actually experiment with this deck is the 5-cost Maleficent that we saw actually in this Amber deck. This one, because it has some synergy with Smee. Someone used that against me on the ladder once, and I was pretty impressed. But next, moving on to Amethyst Steel with a Jafar. 4 Jafars, but interestingly, only 7 of the smaller Jafars. We have 3 copies of the 2-drop Jafar and 4 copies of the Dreadnought. Blue Fairies in this one, so of course you have some Floodborn synergy with cards like Beast, Robin Hood, Tinkerbell, Yzma, and Jafar, giving you some card draw. 2 rabbits, which is something I quite like to see. If you have too many uninkables in a deck like this, what ends up happening is you want to play your Jafar pretty early, but then you have to play the rabbit instead as you can't ink it. 2 copies of Swords, 4 Whole New Worlds, 3 Smash. Smash going to be really important against those Ursulas. Now, Jafar's a very good deck, but it has one matchup in particular which it really struggles with in my experience, which is up against Amber Steel Songs. It's almost unwinnable. Perhaps with a few more control cards, you could maybe have a better matchup into that, but I really doubt it, to be honest. It also can struggle a little bit into Ruby Sapphire. You need to basically as soon as you get your Jafar down, if you play a whole new world, you need to win pretty much in that turn, because otherwise you play a whole new world and Ruby Sapphire then has a million control cards in their hand. One thing that's super fascinating about this one is the lack of friends on the other side. Definitely not something you see very often with Amethyst decks, but of course with the Blue Fairy, with the whole new world, with the rabbits, with the castle, you could argue that there's enough card draw with the beast. I'm certainly surprised to see the lack of friends, but I also think it's pretty interesting, and I'm really excited to see Jafar making the top cut. Jafar's definitely got a place in my heart. I've got a real sweet spot for it. I'm absolutely going to be playing a lot of Jafar decks at the start of set 4 with some of the new cards that have been printed. And overall, I think that Steel Amethyst is a really exciting deck, which you can play in a couple of different ways quite clearly, and that is really, really amazing. All right, up next, speaking of Amber Steel Songs, probably my least favorite deck in the game, mainly because I lost to it and I got absolutely pounded by it. Amber Steel Songs, probably the best deck in the format if it wasn't for its very weak matchup into Ruby Sapphire Control. One way that you can improve your matchup against Ruby Sapphire Control, however, is by playing Sleepy's Flute. So we've seen Sleepy's Flute, we've seen Lanterns, we've seen Pride Lands being the 3 main options. Lantern good against most things. Pride Land's kind of the middle ground, but Sleepy's Flute, very, very good to help you against those Ruby Sapphire decks, because it just gives you a way of gaining lore even if you've lost the board. I've seen one game where Zan Saeed was up against Savage, who are 2 of the top players on the ladder. I think at the point they might have even been 1st and 2nd on the ladder or something like that. And Zan Saeed was able to win with 4 Sleepy's Flutes down on the board and just no cards, no characters on the board, just 4 Sleepy's Flutes. It was pretty impressive. The rest of the things to look at, 4 Smees, 4 Rapunzels, which is something that I've been advocating for quite a lot. 2 Swords, 2 Big Cinderellas, 3 Benja. Honestly, list looks super duper smooth. I really like the look of this one. Obviously, these decks are really difficult to fit everything in, but this one looks like it's managed it. No stitches. I'm very happy to see that. I really don't like the surface stitch in this one when there's lots of good options. 4 Storm Rage on. Sometimes you see people only playing 3 of these and it hurts my soul. But this looks like a really clean setup overall. If I was to play the deck, I think I would build it very, very similar. So, nice. Up next, another Sleepy's Flute version. Again, probably aimed at dealing with that Ruby Sapphire matchup and making that slightly more winnable. Only 3 Smees, but 4 Flutes, which is an early difference. Only 2 Benjas, but adding in an extra copy of Zeus. Also, a couple copy of World's Greatest Criminal Mind is really fascinating to see. Of course, this card has some serious synergy with the Queen, where you can make your opponent's character have more strength and then take it out with World's Greatest Criminal Mind. Only 3 Rapunzels. Personally, I would probably like to see 4, but also only 3 Smees, so that's pretty interesting. Deck also looks very smooth with 2 Cinderellas. Very, very similar looking lists. And yeah, overall, Sapphire, Amber Steel, very, very solid deck. The reason I say it's my least favorite is because it just beats me so much. That's basically probably why. It's so strong. It's so, so strong. Okay, up next, another deck which was represented by 2 players, which is Sapphire Steel. Sapphire Steel, just a very strong deck, has been for a long time. Some different ways you can really go about the ramp tools. That's kind of the main differences we see in these ones. Obviously with Lucky Dime as a top end. Interesting to see Cinderella Stout Tarted as a top end option in this one as well, which is not something you see all the time. But the ramp options, no 1 jump ahead in this one, but there is 4 copies of Mickey, 4 Fishbone Quill, which is kind of the most standard approach. You sometimes see 3 Mickeys. There's also 2 copies of Belle in here. Belle is a card you can see some players utilizing as a ramp option, where they play maybe the 1 jump ahead on turn 2 and then Belle on turn 3 to utilize her ability to ink more cards from hand. But with the lack of 1 jump ahead and only 2 Belles, that's not really something it seems that Killian here is going for. 1 copy of Beast Hard-Headed. Couple Let It Goes. Rise of the Titans is an interesting option. I actually really like to see Baboom in there. Baboom is just a card I'm a huge fan of, honestly. Fire the Cannons, also a card you can see quite often in these decks. I would probably advocate for Fire the Cannons in this one, but in particular just because of Fishbone Quill being able to ink it. But of course, you get to maybe run a couple extra uninkables here, like this extra copy of Swords. 3 Swords is quite a lot. Deck looks very solid overall. One thing I'm going to be... And Nothing to Hide, also a really interesting card to talk about. Nothing to Hide, very good with a whole new world, right? Like you have the option of saying, do I want to play a whole new world? or would I rather not? I am really interested in the idea of playing Nothing to Hide with a discard package down the line, where you use Nothing to Hide to peep at your opponent's hand and decide if you want to discard their hand or if you'd rather just develop some presence on the board instead. And Sapphire Emerald has got a bit of support moving into set 4. There is one thing I absolutely hate about this deck, and that is... Have a think. What is it? There's one card in here which I think that you should always run 4 copies of, and there's not 4 copies of it. And it's Develop Your Brain. I think that this is very poor deck building. Not no, Killian, great. Just as a fundamental premise, dropping Develop Your Brain for me just feels wrong. I would compare it to playing a 61 card deck. It's not a huge deal, but it just feels suboptimal. Develop Your Brain, just such an incredibly consistent card. I think it's very difficult to justify not playing 4 copies of it. And as I say, I would compare it to running a 61 card deck. All right, up next, let's see how different this one is. Fire the Cannons, 3 Babooms, really cool to see. This one's also got no 1 jump ahead. No Develop Your Brains at all, which is really, really fascinating. Wow, that is not something you see very often. No Captain Hooks. This is a much higher curve deck, right? That's the thing to know. If you look here, there's Captain Hooks in here. Develop Your Brain doesn't really count as a 1-drop in fairness, but just a much, much higher curve overall. Babooms, Smees still, 3 Mickeys, 3 Titans, which is definitely respecting locations a lot, as well as 2 copies of Beast Hard-Headed, 4 Bells in this one, 2 Dimes, 2 Let It Goes, and then in the top end, 1 Tamatoa. There was no Tamatoa in this one, but Cinderella. And Simba Fighting Prince. I had to put that in the thumbnail, you know I did. So this card is reading, when you play this character and whenever he banishes another character in a challenge during your turn, you may choose one of draw 2 cards, choose and discard 2 cards, or deal 2 damage to chosen character. Very, very cool to see Simba Fighting Prince in the mixer. Wow. So this is by Jeebus. Jeebus, very good player. Does stream quite a bit as well. So big congratulations to him for making it. I'd be really interested in picking his brains on the lack of Develop Your Brain. I haven't really played any Sapphire Steel, so I'm surprised to see the lack of Develop Your Brain. Again, for me, it just feels like you're trying to fit other things in, and it's comparable to playing a 64 card deck. It's obviously not. You're still playing a 60 card deck. That's just kind of my analogy of cutting Develop Your Brain. I would actually make a case to say that Develop Your Brain is the best card in the game, which is a hot take, but it's just so consistent. You're looking at the top 2 cards, 1 on the bottom, 1 on the top, 1 in your hand for 1 cost. That's just so powerful. Anyway, moving on. We have Emerald Amethyst, and this is by Artabax, who is the GOAT of Emerald Amethyst. Of course, I've been trying to make my Prince John's Purple Dream work, but my dream has turned into a nightmare. It hasn't really quite gone the way I've wanted it to. I did win a stitch with the deck. It's definitely solid, my version, but I think it's fair to say at this point that Artabax, this was the standard kind of setup for these decks, and with good reason. Mother knows best, just providing this deck with a lot of coverage in matchups which it would otherwise struggle with. Artabax did manage to get to the top of the hardcore ladder on Pixelborn as well. So 11 1-drops in this one, 3 Rafikis, 3 Pascal, 4 Merfolk. I have talked to Artabax quite a bit about some of these deck inclusions over the past few weeks as I've been trying to tweak my own list. He's not playing Chernobog's Followers, which Chernobog's Followers is a card which I really, really love, but instead valuing to play less 1-drops for a higher overall curve. Still 4 copies of Flynn. I would actually look at Flynn maybe as being a card with this setup that I would try to reduce the count of. I would honestly argue that more 1-drops might be a better turn 2 than Flynn. Like the ideal turn 2 setup, and Artabax has agreed with me on this, is playing a bunch of 1-drops. And Flynn without the Prince John, not really sure I see it being quite as worth it, to be completely honest with you. So I think Flynn Rider is actually a card I would look at dropping with this setup personally. 3 Cloud Kickers, 2 Maleficents, 4 Crabs, 4 Mother Knows Best. Got the Goats, the Rabbits, 3 Castle, and a couple copies of Tinkerbell. You might be a bit surprised to see her. She is really a tech aimed at dealing with Ruby Amethyst. Minnie Mouse is just such a problem. Pascal Crab can take it out, but that's not exactly the most efficient trade. You don't really want to be using your Crab for that. It can be a nice option though for sure, but then also those Tinkerbells to give you a little bit of extra coverage, because you can give a Madam Mim or a Rafiki, for example, evasive, and then they can just trade out that pesky Minnie Mouse. All right. Congratulations to Artabax. And another Artabax inspired list. This one, no Pascals, which I think is blasphemy. I think Pascal is just the absolute man in these decks because he just gets you that lore, just ticks away, and then you cross the line with the rabbits. But Chernobox instead, 10 1-drops. Again, I'm looking at this Flynn Rider as being a card which I don't really think is putting its weight compared to more of the 1-drops. I probably will actually experiment with Artabax's Emerald Amethyst list in the next week or so. One Pinocchio, which Artabax has kind of gone back and forth on playing a Pinocchio. Currently, he's not rocking it. 3 Kit Cloud Kickers, 2 Maleficents, only 3 Crabs, 3 Mother Knows Best. A random Wildcat in there to give you some coverage of dealing with items. 3 Castle, and also Yzma as a top-end option. No Tinkerbells in this one, no Pascal Crabs, so this one's going to really struggle against Ruby Amethyst, but there's not much Ruby Amethyst in the top cut, so not teching for Ruby Amethyst clearly has worked out, but I would definitely recommend Artabax's list if you're looking to play Emerald Amethyst. Prince John's Purple Dream, let's not talk about it. I had a dream. I love just experimenting with new deck ideas and trying to make it work. I've not really been too happy with it overall, but I still had a lot of fun playing the deck, and yeah, I think Artabax's one is clearly the way to go at this point, so yeah. Good job, Artabax. Everyone's like, it always was. All right, well, I just like building decks, man. I don't want to play Emerald Steel for 3 months. I don't want to be known as the Emerald Steel guy, you know? Anyway, Ruby Sapphire up next. Ruby Sapphire has 3 different players on Ruby Sapphire. Very much considered, well, it's very much a deck which a lot of the top players will just play a lot. And one thing that I really love about Emerald Amethyst is Emerald Amethyst has a very, very strong matchup into this deck as long as it's built quick enough. So this deck, obviously, you guys kind of know how it's working. You're just looking to ramp up early on. Really, the biggest difference we've seen in these decks over the last few weeks is the introduction of How Far I'll Go. I actually watched Moana the other day, and my highlight of the film was this song. It's a banger, and the card's very good too. You look at the top 2 cards of your deck, put one into your hand and the other in your inkwell face down and exerted. So it's like one jump ahead, which is adding a card to your hand, but also you get a choice over that. It's like one jump ahead mixed with Develop Your Brain. Very strong card, and of course if you can sing it with something like a Grammatala or a Flavisham or a Maui as well, Maui being able to sing is definitely something you should bear in mind. Very, very strong indeed. I do like the inclusion of a couple copies of Shield of Virtue, working in a similar way to Maui's Fishhook, but being a really nice option for Flavisham to just draw you cards as well. Only 2 copies of Queen of Hearts is asking for trouble in my opinion. I don't respect that. I think that is not a good idea. I think it's a bit too greedy. It's certainly going to help you in mirror matchups where like these extra big powerful cards are, but against anything that's even slightly aggressive, this deck is just going to get absolutely wrecked. Like, okay, if you draw your Queen of Hearts, you're good to go, but if you don't, yeah, you may as well just go next, right? So that's very, very greedy deck building, which, in fairness, greedy deck building can be the way to go if you just say that you just want to dodge your bad matchups, but I don't think this one's going to win the tournament, but maybe I'm wrong. Maybe it's going to queue into lots of Ruby Sapphire mirrors early on. It's going to dodge the quicker players, and maybe they'll get away with it. Let's see if 2 Queen of Hearts is common. I would say at least 3. I would play 4 probably, personally. This one's on 3. Not a huge difference between 2 and 3, but I don't know. This just looks a lot better to me somehow. A little bit less greedy. 4 copies of How Far I'll Go. No Develop Your Brains, though, in this one, which I know is something that Moyen also did experiment with. I will say, I think in this deck, the lack of Develop Your Brain makes a little bit more sense just because your curve is a lot more aggressive and you don't have the whole new world card draw. So it's less common for you to have that 1 ink spare. So I think in this deck, it makes more sense than I would say dropping it in the Sapphire Steel deck because, you know, with your Fishbone Quill, you can't just endlessly ink. It's not like you have infinite ink, really, without the whole new worlds. 3 Tremaines, 4 Medusas, which this one only had 2 Tremaines, 3 Medusas. I love being greedy on this kind of 6 cost area because I think these are 2 of the best cards. I have to say, this deck, I like the look of a lot. Again, no Develop Your Brains. I'm not super sure on, but I can see certainly the logic, as I mentioned. 2 Scars, 4 B-Preps. This just looks like a very cleanly built deck. What I like seeing is lots of 4 of copies. Like, that just looks like a refined list. 2 copies of kind of these more uninkable cards, which are a bit more clunky. This list just looks very, very smooth to me. Again, lack of Develop Your Brain. Certainly an interesting decision, but this looks good. I like the look of it a lot. And finally, the last Ruby and Sapphire deck, This one also only on 2 Queen of Hearts. Couple of McDuck Manors in the mixer here as well. Just 1 Tremaine, 3 Scars. I feel like Tremaine is just really, really good, to be honest. I really like the look of this list the most. No Develop Your Brains actually in this one either. And only 2 Talas, 3 How Far I Goes, 2 Judy Hops, 1 Let It Go. Yeah, for me, if I was going to recommend one, I'm going to give it to Niles Roland. This one looks really smooth. Again, maybe I would be tempted to try and add Develop Your Brain in there still, but I don't have much experience with Ruby Sapphire. And finally, last but never least, it is the best deck in the format. It is Emerald Steel with Prince John. Why do I think it's the best deck in the format? I just do. It's just got a very even matchup split in a similar way to Ruby Amethyst. Doesn't have a single awful matchup. It can beat everything. As long as players aren't teched for it, it's great. I just love it. It's just great. If I'm playing in Lille, I'll be playing this deck. That's for sure. So this one, 10 1-drops, which is a very reasonable decision. And I actually do like the split of the 1-drops in here from Steven Silverman with just 2 Captain Hooks and 4 Robin Hoods. You really want your turn 1 to be a card which can quest, but obviously Captain Hook when going second can be very good. Synergizes with Smee a little bit and gives you some extra coverage against those very, very pesky locations. 4 Flins, only 2 Babooms, which feels a little bit low to me personally. I'm a big fan of Baboom. Also only 3 Smees. I would also always play 4 Smees. I think Smee is too good not to play 4 copies of. 2 Kit Cloud Kickers. Pretty reasonable. Kit Cloud Kicker, absolutely incredible in mirror matchups. If your opponent tries to play an Ursula, no, just bounce it back. Only 3 Strength of a Raging Fire. Also kind of reasonable. I would probably play 4 again. I think that it's just a card that you're looking for very often in certain matchups, for example, against Ruby Amethyst. Now, what's really interesting about this one is the 4 copies of Tinkerbell Tiny Tactician. Not a card you see very often at all. Obviously, allows you to play Tinkerbell Giant Pharaoh without going to 6 ink. I do actually like Tinkerbell Tiny Tactician a lot, but I'm not really convinced by it, to be completely honest with you. Like, with Beast, with Robin Hood, with Tinkerbell, maybe Morph would be a more reasonable inclusion. I'm not super convinced. I do like the card. I have to say, I do like the card, but probably not in this one personally. 4 copies of Ursula, 1 Tiana. Tiana's great. Personally, I think 2 is the sweet spot for Tiana. 1 Whole New World, which is very random, but an interesting inclusion. Obviously, your Tinkerbell could discard it. In certain situations, it could help you, of course. It's definitely interesting. I wouldn't go for it personally. Only 2 Beasts. Also feels a little bit low on Beast. 4 Robin Hoods, 4 Tinks. Overall, I definitely don't hate the list. I would obviously change a few things. As mentioned, I would play more copies of Baboom, more Smees. And then I would probably be not playing, the Tinkerbell package most likely. Increase the Tianas, reduce the Whole New Worlds, yada, yada, yada. But overall, I can be very critical of Emerald Steel lists. I'm happy to see that there's no copies of Zeus in this deck. I really don't like people playing Zeus in these decks, and some very good players do. And this one doesn't have Zeus, so that's good. Overall, solid list. I would obviously change a little bit, but yeah. Up next we have Adam Roper. And Adam Roper's only on the 8 1-drops. No Captain Hooks. 2 Babooms, but 4 Mr. Smees. I do like the decision to go for Robin Hoods over Captain Hooks as well. 2 Benja. Actually, this deck not playing Benja. Oh, yeah. Yeah. I think you've got to play Benja. Benja is just so important for the Ruby Sapphire matchup in particular. Also very good against Sapphire Steel. Very good against like Sleepy's Flute, Amber Steel decks as well. I think that 2 Benja is the minimum I would play. I would probably go to 3 personally. Couple copies of Kit, only 3 Strength. 2 Zeus, which hurts my heart. Might be wondering, like, why do I not like Zeus? Well, what are you going to do with Zeus? Also, no Friar Tucks in this list. Okay. I really don't like this one. Like, the deck is so tight, right? I don't hate all the cards that they've added in, but it's more like the cards that they're not playing. Like, not playing Friar Tuck. Come on, man. Have some respect for my boy. This one has 2 Tianas, which I think is the sweet spot. This deck looks very, very solid. I really like the list. Personally, I wouldn't play Along Came Zeus. Why? What are you going to sing Zeus with? You're just going to hard cast it and it's uninkable when you have Strength in the deck? Really? Like, you're playing an uninkable Zeus instead of the Strength. And I think that the reason to play Zeus is because it can target locations, in fairness. It does give you a little bit of coverage against Queen's Castle, for example. I would guess that's probably the reason to include it. But I don't know, man. I'm not sure I would agree with that too much. But the rest of the deck I really like. Literally the only thing I don't like about this one is the Zeus. The rest looks super duper smooth. I would play a very similar version to this. Very, very similar indeed. So good deck from Adam Roper. Good job, mate. And finally, the last Emerald Steel deck to look at, and the last deck in the top 16, is by The Rank. There's a player called The Rat that also uses a 3 here. Maybe they've renamed, maybe it's just someone different. I don't know. So this one is on Captain Hook, not on the 1-drop Robin Hood, not on the 5-drop Robin Hood. What a lot of you might know that I like to do is I was playing the 1-drop Robin Hood without the shift target, which I think is a super reasonable option. The reason I don't really like Captain Hook as the only other 1-drop here is because you want a card which can quest. Questing with Captain Hook, like against, for example, Ruby Sapphire, you play your Captain Hook on turn 1, and then you quest with it, and then they Queen of Hearts you. And that is losing you the game, right? Like, you want to be able to quest with your card that you play on turn 1. So I definitely prefer the 1-drop Robin Hood in these decks over Captain Hook. Obviously, Captain Hook gives you that little bit of extra coverage against Queen's Castle, little bit of Smee synergy. Only 2 Babooms in this one again. I would say that all of these guys are a little bit low on Baboom. I would say 3 to 4 is more where I would be playing, but I love this card. 4 Flins, 4 Smees, 4 Sudden Chills, 4 Ursula, 3 Benja, which I think is a nicer amount. 1 Kick Cloud Kicker, sure. 4 Strength, which I also think is optimal. 2 Zeus again. What are you actually like doing with Zeus? Probably targeting locations. But what are you going to sing it with? 4 Donald Ducks, 4 Beasts. And 4 Daisy Duck. Daisy Duck's a really interesting one. In my experience of playing Daisy Duck, she ends up in the Inkwell 9 times out of 10. But clearly the rank believes in Daisy Duck with 4 copies. I do think it's important to have that little bit of extra discard. So including some extra cards to discard is pretty nice. That's why I'm not a big fan of this one at all without the extra discard. Like, there's no copies of Friar Tuck at all here. This one has some Friar Tucks. This one has Friar Tuck and Daisy Duck. Personally, I would look at playing Hypnotize instead of the Daisy Ducks. I think Daisy Duck may be a bit too slow, but she is solid. I've ended up with her quite a few times in tournament decks, but I always feel like she's the weakest card in the deck. Overall, I really like the look of this list. The main thing that's kind of jumping out to me is there is a lack of something. Tiana. Lack of Tiana. I think Tiana's very, very good, and I would probably be playing like 2 Tianas, 2 Hypnotize, and maybe drop the Zeus as well. Overall, though, really, really interesting top 16 meta game. Big shout out to Ravensburger's design team for the insane balance we've had for set 3. Truly remarkable, truly mind-blowing. I've absolutely loved it. Probably going to be the last time we look at the meta game from set 3. Although I suppose we will do a review of the big tournaments happening, the Lorcana challenges in Atlanta and Lille, which is still being played with set 3. And then we can kind of do, while we look at the decks that did well there, we can kind of give the final review of the set 3 meta. If you would be interested in me doing that in the next week, like the final review of the set 3 meta before, of course, the big Lorcana challenge tournaments come through, definitely let me know, because that's something I would be interested in doing. All right, guys, I appreciate you watching the whole video. The key word, the secret code, if you will, in the comments is Inkwell, because that's where Daisy belongs, in the Inkwell. All right, guys, thanks so much. Bye now. And I only say that because every time I play Daisy Duck, I ink her. Bye now.